There's a through line of themes in Westerfeld's books, Leviathan and Behemoth, where the story of Darren and Alec is essentially imprinted upon by the dynamic of who and what is sovereign and who should be and act loyal to them. In story, as in real life, the command of air beast Leviathan and sea beast Behemoth by the fictional Captain Hobbs mirrors the authorship of the books Leviathan and Behemoth by the political philosopher Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century. The real Hobbes is considered an influential figure in the understanding of social contract theory, where he postulated that the natural state of man was one of unrestricted violent competition for survival, such that life in this natural state is essentially a war of all against all. In this so-called natural state of war against all, there is no society, and a person's life is likely to be solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short. To paraphrase rather comprehensive pieces of literature, Hobbes's solution is a social contract that allows man to go from war of all against all to a functioning society. Hobbes proposed that there should exist a figure, a person in whom all others would surrender some rights and freedoms to violence, such that society can be facilitated, while the ability and the stakes of violence would be essentially entrusted to this one person. Only this one figure would be the final and central moral authority to commit and threaten violence against people, to uphold an ordered and stable society, and by extension its laws and traditions. A supreme sovereign. This figure Hobbes christened a Leviathan, after the biblical primordial sea beast that embodied the chaos of the world and threatened to consume all of God's creation. For context, Hobbes wrote his Leviathan during, and Behemoth after, the English Civil War, so we can definitely infer some bias on his part as to his postulate on human nature. We can relate this philosophical basis to the story of Darren and Alec through their interactions and notions of loyalty and command. When we last left them at the end of Westerfeld's Leviathan, Darren's Darwinists of the British Empire and Alec's Clankers of the Austro-Hungarian Empire put aside their differences to come together and escape the onslaught of the mutual enemy, the Germans. Now, as Darren and Alec fly on the air beast Leviathan to continue Dr. Barlow's mission to the Ottoman Empire, both are confronted with conflicting feelings of loyalty, both to their respective sovereigns and each other. For Darren, Leviathan, and by extension the Admiralty and the British Empire, are her supreme sovereign, that she must serve in order to keep her home. But she's also loyal to Alec, a supposed enemy of that same sovereign. She's constantly wondering how she may be essentially betraying her home in helping Alec and keeping his secrets. Meanwhile, Alec, having learned that he would himself become a supreme sovereign upon the death of the current emperor of Austria-Hungary, is conflicted between his sense that he should become this sovereign, if at least to end the war, and his feeling that he belongs on Leviathan, which is, in a way, a substitute sovereign. Since Alec was raised in the hierarchy of the Austrian royal court under the emperor's sovereignty, we might guess that becoming part of the hierarchy of the Leviathan would have some appeal, because unlike his status as unwanted back in his original home, where his sense of belonging didn't extend beyond the loyalty of his servants and retainers, on Leviathan, he might feel he can belong and have a new home. Instead of being an heir to an empire, but needing to await the emperor's death to do so, and hide in the meantime, on Leviathan, Alec can be assured safety and even loyal companionship, at least in Darren as a start. This is social contract theory in action. Alec isn't a supreme sovereign, but in serving one, the Leviathan air beast, he is safe and can have a sense of belonging. Alec's conflict comes from the sense that, under Vulgar's guidance, and in honor of his late parents' wishes, Alec would and should detach himself from the Darwinists and hide himself until he can become a sovereign and end the war. With Vulgar's influence, Alec is consistently pushed to look upon his newfound allies, and even his newfound friend Dylan, as a threat to his future sovereignty. After all, what kind of sovereign gets themselves captured and locked up, even for safekeeping? So when Leviathan reaches Istanbul, capital of the Ottoman Empire, escaping Leviathan is pushed to the fore of Alec's mind. Circumstances lead to Vulgar and Alec being separated during the escape attempt. So for the first time, Alec is in command, without Vulgar's guidance and example to lean on. It also means that without Vulgar's influence, Alec essentially becomes a new sovereign in his own right, at least where his few remaining retainers are concerned. When presented the choice to hide in the countryside or go into Istanbul looking for opportunity, Alec chooses the city. It is there that Alec learns more about the Germans' operations in Istanbul, and finds an opportunity to strike back at the German war effort, rather than hide himself away again. He happens upon the Committee for Unity and Progress, a grassroots revolutionary movement founded to end the Sultan's power and end German influence in the Ottoman Empire. Under Vulgar's guidance, we can be assured by story's end that he would have dissuaded Alex from allying himself with so-called anarchists, because their philosophy demands taking political power away from monarchs and other such supreme sovereigns. Instead, Alec recognizes them as valuable allies in his self-proclaimed newfound purpose to end the war and take his rightful place as sovereign in Austria-Hungary by helping them defeat the German operation in Istanbul. The real-life author Hobbes described in his follow-up book, Behemoth, the aspect of the English Civil War that involved the different factions of society that together compromised the power of the supreme sovereign, the king. In Westerfeld's Behemoth, we see a parallel in a society where multiple factions seek to undermine the power of their supreme sovereign and come together by the end to succeed. While not so much text is dedicated in story to the dynamics of a revolution in a society under a supreme sovereign, there is some political and social theory we can apply to understand the importance and implications of the revolution as presented in story, which we'll get to shortly. While Alec is trying to fulfill his destiny in Istanbul, Darren is herself still trying to serve Leviathan, while still looking out for Alec, even as far away as they are. On top of entanglements with Barlow's diplomatic mission, Vulgar's need for outside information concerning Alec, and the Leviathan's need to be resupplied and not impounded by the Ottomans, Darren is bounced back and forth between essentially too many taskmasters, until she's finally given a mission off the airship. Since the diplomatic mission to keep the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and especially not allied with the Germans, seems to falter, the Admiralty gives the Leviathan, and by extension Darren, the task of bringing down Ottoman defenses, so the Leviathan can bring the Behemoth to Istanbul and destroy the German dreadnoughts based there. From story's beginning, those German dreadnoughts are a threat to the war effort, because they can block resupply efforts going from the British Empire to Russia and its war effort. When the Germans gave their dreadnoughts to the Ottomans, they placed themselves where they can provoke hostile action against either the British or the Russians, and thus drag the Ottomans into war on the German side. So, by the sovereign authority of the British Empire, the Admiralty, the Leviathan, and Captain Hobbes, Darren is sent out on a dangerous mission, one where, out of her group, only she is spared death or capture. With her mission to sabotage the Ottoman anti-Kraken nets a success, Darren's confronted with a choice. Either she can wait and hope to be picked up by Leviathan, that's supposed to return and retrieve her, or she can make her way to Istanbul and seek out Alec to help him. She chooses to find Alec, and not coincidentally starts to uncover clues to the German operation in Istanbul, which eventually culminates in the discovery of a large Tesla tower that would destroy Leviathan when it would come up to Istanbul with Behemoth in tow. Darren finds Alec discreetly operating with his new revolutionary allies, and under the guise of conducting a secret mission to help keep the Ottomans out of the war, proceeds to join in the efforts to outfit and conduct the revolution to topple the Sultan. In service to one sovereign, the British Empire, and to another sovereign from a certain perspective, Alec, Darren helps to depose the Ottoman sovereign. Come night of the revolution, Alec's, Darren's, and the committee's mission to overcome the Sultan's mechanical war elephants and destroy the Tesla Tower is successful. The Leviathan and Behemoth destroy the German dreadnoughts, and the Sultan is taken into hiding, not unlike how Alec was the night his parents were murdered. However, Alec's loyal retainers, Klopp and Bauer, are hurt, and while the revolution is still in full swing, they're in danger of the Sultan's mechanized forces coming to either kill them or take them prisoner. Once again, both Darren and Alec each have their choices. Alec wants to take his chances to stay and support the committee's revolution as a way to continue his fight against the Germans, and he wants Dylan to join him. Darren wants simply to return to Leviathan and for Alec to come with him. After deliberation and assurances that Alec belongs with him on Leviathan, and that they have long earned a status above suspicion among the crew, Alec forgoes staying for the revolution and his role in it to become part of the Leviathan's crew once again, with Darren as companion. In a way, Alec postpones his goal of attaining sovereignty to maintain companionship with Darren and the Leviathan, with both the crew and the beasts, with that ecosystem once again becoming his sovereign. It's worth noting that we, the reader, and even Darren herself, would be right to be skeptical about going back to Leviathan. Before Darren was sent off on mission, she was taken aside by the officers, and as Darren first expected punishment, she was instead presented commendation for just one of her many heroic acts throughout these stories. The rub was that it was prelude to giving her a task that was extremely dangerous and likely to get her captured or killed. One way to look at this is they were praising him as a way to coerce Darren into going on a deadly secret operation, one that, if failed, would likely incur such a backlash that the Ottomans might just join the war against Britain on the spot. To mitigate this risk, Captain Hobbs may well have chosen Darren and her fellow midshipmen as crew experienced and skillful enough for the task, but also expendable enough to justify incurring the risk. That's the dynamic under a hierarchy with a supreme sovereign on top. If the goals of the supreme sovereign, in whom all judgment of violence is entrusted and adhered to, demand a sacrifice, then it is not to be questioned. After Darren completes her mission, she has no guarantee that Captain Hobbs would risk the Leviathan and its crew to go and retrieve her from hostile territory. Whether or not Darren could feasibly avoid capture in place long enough to be picked up is a question rendered moot when she chooses to seek Alec in Istanbul, and by extension his companionship. Even she is not explicitly certain why she's risking her life to go to a barking prince, when leaving for the Mediterranean and rejoining the British forces seems feasible. Whatever the reason, clear or not, why Darren would seek Alec before Leviathan, and why Alec would forego leading a revolution to rejoin Darren and Leviathan, it's becoming more apparent that loyalty to companions is becoming more important to our characters than upholding the hierarchy of supreme sovereigns. Speaking of toppling supreme sovereigns, the ability of the Committee's revolution to dethrone the Ottoman Sultan is no small feat, and no small effort either. Unlike real history, as cited in Story's epilogue, the Committee's revolution already failed once 6 years ago, by the time Alec and Darren come to Istanbul. The stated reason for the failure is that the individual factions of the Committee just weren't united enough against the Sultan's military forces. And the reason both stated and realized for the Committee's successful revolution in Story is that the different factions are fully united and ready to stand against the Sultan this time. There's a real-life science to understanding how revolutions are formed, executed, and subsequently affect the political structure of a state, such as a city, nation, or empire. The theory I want to use is called selectorate theory, which consists of the following. Whether you're concerned with an office of power or a policy to affect governance, selectorate theory is summarized as dividing up the population into 3 categories. First, everyone who can vote. Second, everyone who will vote. And third, the minimum number required to win the vote, and thus affect the change in political power. The dynamics of the politics change for both the power seeker and the voters depending on how much of the population is needed to win. For an aside, the so-called voters need not always be the kind that submit ballots, as it were. It is simply anyone who explicitly and tangibly supports the power in question. And as we will see, earning votes is not always about winning hearts and minds, but just as often involves offering benefits in various forms. Political privilege, valued public services, private rewards, or simply gold. In selectorate theory, there's a scale between a position of power requiring fewer supporters and one requiring more. Respectively, this is autocracy, rule of one, and democracy, rule of people. The most typical autocrat one may think of is a king, and in our case, an explicitly supreme sovereign. The way the autocrat works is, while they, as a single person, can't do much for society by themselves, their power manifests in getting others to do what is needed, presumably for the society to function. This is a rudimentary basis for the idea of the social contract theory. You may not be free or empowered to do everything you may want, and where society is concerned you may have obligations, even substantial ones. But as long as that society benefits your life more than going it alone, then the incentive is to support and maintain that society, and by extension the ruling class. In an autocratic or near-autocratic system, governance is conducted not by majority rule, but by the fewest people needed to effect the governance. At minimum, people are needed to collect the treasure of the state, to distribute the treasure as reward for work on behalf of the state, and to raise and maintain forces for the violence and the threat of violence needed to assure compliance with the order as established by the power holder, the autocrat in this case. The minimum required people to run the state in question are not necessarily individuals, but more likely represent social classes that rule over the rest of society on behalf of the power holder. With a king as an example, you're just as likely to find classes of nobility and soldiers that together extract wealth from the people under the state and use force or threat of force to ensure adherence to that society's laws. And so the king then justly rewards those classes with wealth, privilege, and other things of value. In such a society, the king then doesn't need to satisfy everyone or even most people's desires for things of value, because if all he needs are the political minority, that are the nobility and army, to stay in power, then they need only give them rewards. Giving out gold to the people, while a crowd pleaser, will be objectively a waste if those people offer nothing for keeping the king in power. As a state gets more and more democratic, instead of a few individuals or social classes to collect wealth and keep everyone in line, more and more classes and distinct demographics of people contribute to the wealth and power of that state. At a certain point, it's harder to give enough individuals or groups tangible rewards, such as gold or title. It's more cost effective to offer favorable public policies that benefit more people. Examples include public infrastructure, state-run services, and institutions that serve everybody, or more people at least, and to which everybody contributes to uphold and maintain. As for why a state would lean more autocratic or democratic is an entire discussion unto itself. How selectorate theory relates to the story of Behemoth is in how the Committee for Unity and Progress uses the principles of selectorate theory to conduct a revolution that successfully unseats a monarch. As depicted in story, the various demographics resident and represented in Istanbul hold distinctive cultural and religious spaces and iconography, even so far as operating their own walking machines as a kind of local community-based law enforcement, although expressly unarmed. What this says about the depicted Ottoman Empire is that while supreme sovereign authority rests with the Sultanate and the institutions associated with the throne, the different demographics encompassed by the empire and represented in Istanbul in story can imply that the society and state at large depend on the Sultanate offering at least some more universal political freedoms and privileges to those demographics in order to maintain and grow the empire's power. When the Sultanate attains the support, both active or passive, of just enough of the different factions, then who remains can be safely, relatively, ignored or marginalized. That's where the army and police come in. In fact, from an autocrat's perspective, having most of the population divided into factions is beneficial to staying in power, because an autocrat can lower the cost to buy loyalty by making some or more of the factions into the other or even the enemy, and so present themselves as the key to maintaining societal order and growth. The price for that loyalty can include privilege and control over various state functions, such as finances, trade, services, and of course, state violence. In short, it's divide and rule. For the revolution to succeed, then, the Committee for Unity and Progress has to reach out between all the different factions and, in reaching across cultural and linguistic barriers, foster a political and social unity where most or all participants see and have a stake in a future made better without the Ottoman Sultan. To build this unity, they have to reach out to as many people as possible that can and are willing to support the revolution, including those integrated into the bureaucracy and institutions of the empire. Communication of roles to play in the revolution, not to mention why most everyone should be invested in the committee's vision for the future, would be vitally important in succeeding. So, how to communicate? We do get some indication of press freedoms in Istanbul, especially where a news publication being dominated by German sponsorship is concerned, as it helps spread news of a diplomatic incident involving an out-of-control mechanized elephant and a trunk-surfing and spice-throwing midshipman. What this implies is that while there is an ostensibly more free press in Istanbul, such that relevant current events would be written about and then passed on to readers, without a known culture and history of press being independent of government or business influence, there's a very good chance that any organization for opposing and influencing the Sultanate government, coordinated through a paper's editorial authority, can be, in a sense, controlled. With appeals to patriotism, loyalty to the sovereign, or even implicit threat of sanction or violence, it would be easy for the Sultanate government to cow writers into softening or reframing their language, such that opposition to the government is predictably managed. For the committee to get its ideas out to the public and gather the support it needs, they need to distribute information to enough people to such an extent that the people's common knowledge increases, and they realize they are not alone in their dissent towards the Sultan's rule, and that supporting the revolution would offer them more for their future. In story, the ability to communicate clandestinely with the population at large is accomplished by a special machine called the Spider, a printing press dedicated solely to printing books with special text in a code that everyone interested in the revolution may be well inclined to read. Whatever the subjects of the books themselves, the secret code shares more information that may not draw the attention of Sultanate authorities, and thus hides in plain sight. With enough distribution over a long enough period, more and more people can be convinced to sympathize and even support the revolution when the time comes. If Darren and Alec hadn't happened upon Zavin, Lilith, their Nini, and the committee at large, there is a chance that the revolution might have succeeded, although somewhat bloodier. The committee walkers might have taken out the Sultan mech elephants, but would have certainly suffered bombardment from the German dreadnoughts. Leviathan and Behemoth might have made it to destroy those dreadnoughts, but the air beast might have fell to the giant Tesla tower, leaving Behemoth without control. Despite the committee's best efforts, there was still a chance that the Sultan might have held on to power and would later take harsher measures to stamp out the committee, and certainly join the war on Germany's side against Britain. Even if this had come to pass, the committee's goal of winning the hearts and minds of Istanbul's people would still be upheld, and in some way continue after a likely reprisal. By reaching as many people as possible, giving them all the common knowledge that their lives can be better without the Sultan, and seeing the Sultan brutally crack down on the people with whom the people have their sympathies, it would have ensured that the Sultan would not be safe for long against popular dissent. Essentially, a revolution and then putting down that revolution would make revolution more likely in the future. Without Darren and Alec's contributions, the committee's revolution might not have succeeded, but the political movement for remaking the Ottoman Empire into a more politically and economically inclusive society would have continued. It just so happened that through Darren's and Alec's actions, the victory was so total that the Sultan essentially conceded defeat, or at least his circle of retainers felt their Sultanate's power was defeated, and so fled on his airship, and left the rest of the battle meaningless. In a great expansion from Leviathan, in Behemoth, we get to see far more interaction between the various technologies inherent in the world interact with society at large. In the clanker-influenced society of the Ottoman Empire, there's far more than just military walkers. There's walkers as personal and commercial transport, literally formed and illustrated as pack animals, in the way we typically view automobiles, trucks, and buses, even as the most prestigious transport in the mechanical elephants. Even trains essentially get upgraded with their own arms for loading and unloading. There's various machines used for entertainment, or as more mobile furniture, like Nini's Turtle Walker 4-poster bed. There's libraries that use sophisticated machinery to store, catalog, and retrieve text in book form, in a way similar to the first real-life computers, punch cards and all, but with the additional feature of little robots sent to fetch the books, altogether like the modern internet in mechanical form. More than what was implied by the use of weaponized walkers in Europe, all the different walkers and mechanical technologies used in Ottoman society suggest a long tradition of manufacturing and craftsmanship that could very well predate Britain's truncated Industrial Revolution. It would be too easy to give credit to the mechanization program in Istanbul solely to the Germans as part of their ploy to tie the Ottoman Empire to Germany's imperial ambitions, as well as joining the war. It would imply that the diverse cultures making up the Ottoman Empire could not together build an advanced and growing society capable of great industrial feats, and a nascent transfer to a kind of prototype information age. In the simple depiction of transport as mechanized versions of old-fashioned livestock, Dr. Barlow believes it is the Ottomans and its people not forgetting the web of life. This feels more like a Darwinist imperial lens to view something more complex. In my opinion, as walkers are far more expensive in terms of material production and maintenance, the point of mechanizing the various aspects of society is not simply for efficiency's sake. Vehicles on wheels would be far more effective to that end. And it's more than just for the symbology of the various people's religions within the empire. One way to look at it is that by turning their draft animals and mythical creatures into working machines, the power, prestige, and venerable tradition they imply can be realized in a way beyond what is possible, with images, statues, effigies, and other forms of artistic depictions. Even something like a library that is computerized via mechanical computer and book retrieving robots, in a sense exemplifies the feeling of comprehending the mass of human knowledge and attempting to categorize it enough that what you're looking for can be found, as a wondrous alternative to trudging through the aisles and stacks looking for what you need. Assuming, of course, your goal isn't to simply get lost in the mass of text. While the Ottoman Empire in Scott Westerfeld's alternate world is called Clanker, they don't seem to regard the distinction in the same way that Germans or Austrians do, in contrast to Darwinist power. We don't see any strife or objection to fabricated creatures as a rule in their society, and the German program to mechanize the Ottomans has earned them more dissent than appreciation, and it's likely more to do with the German view of imperial power being imposed rather than mechanization itself. Apparently, dissatisfaction with the German program helped unite the committee's revolutionaries against the Sultan even further than what dissent they already had against the Sultan. If we try to imagine the inverse happening, that a Darwinist power like Britain would institute a Darwinization program into the Ottoman Empire, apart from any religious objection, I could imagine that parts of Ottoman society, in all its diversity, would attempt to embrace and use the genetic engineering power on offer to do similarly what was done with the mechanization program. Turn the facets of Ottoman life into more vibrant and glorious versions of themselves. As surely as domesticating wild animals allows for breeds that are fashionable as well as useful, I could imagine the Ottoman culture depicted would attempt to bring their idealized forms of real and mythical creatures to life. Instead of mechanical scarab beetle vehicles, they might make actual, living, larger-than-life scarabs to ride on. Elephants could be made larger and more grand than any captured, tamed, or embellished as before. Larger living turtles as walking furniture. Even breeds of draft animals like horses, donkeys, or buffalo can be engineered to be more aesthetically pleasing to the society at large. And as surely as Darwinist Britain turned mythical krakens into reality, Ottomans with the same genetic engineering may also breed creatures to resemble greater beasts in mythology. So far in the series, we've seen the air beast Leviathan, named after the mythical primordial sea beast, and a sea creature Behemoth, named after the mythic land beast. I wouldn't be surprised if a Darwinist Ottoman Empire would conceive of the final member of the trio, the sky beast Ziz, a griffin-like creature quite unlike the serpent Leviathan turned into a sky whale. Alas, that would have to be an alternate history of Westerfeld's alternate history, as a final entry in the trilogy is written. To conclude the final story in Westerfeld's Leviathan trilogy, Darren and Alec continue their journey together on the Leviathan, but this time their course takes them away from the war in Europe and towards the east, their vessel's mission unknown. Darren is happy to be home aboard the Air Beast, but Alec has been left hanging upon news of the Pope's death, and the idea that his inheritance of the Austria-Hungarian Empire may be in question, not to mention his religious certainty of his destiny to end the war and avenge his parents. Suffice it to say, the war is not over yet, when we return in Scott Westerfeld's Goliath. Next, we come back to the world of Captain Josette Dupré and her airship and crew Mistral, as they leave a battle victorious, but with urgent need to prepare for a new, more personal battle yet to come. They must travel to the heart of their empire and find the support they need to take the battle to the enemy and reclaim Josette's hometown, hopefully without falling prey to dangerous political schemes and intrigues. When we return, it's Robin Bennis's By Fire Above.